Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about those big games in the SEC. Ole Miss goes on the road to Florida. A&M goes on the road to Auburn. Two really tough games that could be totally crazy with the CFP schedule that we got, or the CFP race that we got going on. Going to be really interesting, and two teams that very much want to get into that dance. Got to win out the rest of the way if they want to. But let's get into a couple of the consequences of the 12-team playoff. They're starting to show as we get down the home stretch of the season. A couple of the things that people that were critics of the 12-team playoff were talking about, they're starting to show just a little bit. And let's break it down real quickly here because I think that a lot of them are very interesting. Some of them are not quite as big a deal of others. Some of them are relatively big deals, and we'll have to figure them out pretty quickly. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing in. We'll start with Lane Kiffin. He made some comments yesterday talking about the conference title race and talking about how some coaches out there are just not very interested in the conference title because what if you do go and then you get knocked out? What if you do go and you lose by 30 points and you get knocked out for a team that has maybe less losses because they didn't have to play in that game? That is something that a lot of people are worried about. Really, across the sport, I don't think that's necessarily a crazy thing to be worried about. And Ward Manuel did not make it any easier. He was asked about this at the end of the show on Tuesday, I believe, and he was talking about it and said, "We are going to evaluate teams through their conference title race." How is that possible? How are we allowing them to knock a team that got to the SEC title, got the luxury of playing in the SEC title, and then fell? I never understand why we would punish those teams, and frankly, you really just can't do it. I'm not saying that it won't happen, but it kind of can't happen. If it does happen, let's just say that Alabama gets to the SEC title. They play Texas, they lose by 21 points, let's just say, and they drop behind Tennessee. I'm telling you now, the Big Ten and the SEC would have their own postseason set up by March. I'm just being totally honest. It would be over. From that moment forward, it would be over. The entirety of college football would change essentially overnight if you did that. So they can't do that. They have to, I mean have to, keep these teams. Not only do they have to keep them in the field, they probably got to keep them as host teams. If you make your Big Ten or you make your SEC championship, and probably won't be as quite as big of a problem in the Big Ten, likely could have been in different scenarios, but as of right now, it doesn't look like it's going to be too big of an issue. The thing I'm wondering is, I don't think you can even knock these teams out of the field. I don't think you can knock them out of a host position. I think you have to give everyone that played in the Big Ten or the SEC championship a host position because, frankly, those are the two guys that can pick up their ball and go play elsewhere. It's obviously not the ideal situation, obviously not the way that you want to be making decisions, but that's kind of the reality of this situation. If you were going to knock out someone that played in the SEC championship when, frankly, they don't necessarily have to, you're going to have a problem on your hands. Whether you're the CFP committee or the college football fans or the coaches or anyone, it is going to be a battle back and forth. I can absolutely promise you that. So if Bama goes and loses to Texas, or say Texas goes and loses to Bama, neither of those teams can fall out. If A&M goes and they lose to Bama, they can't fall out. We can argue all day whether or not they should, whether or not one team is more deserving, whether or not one team is better. But the reality is they're playing in a game that now can hypothetically can do more harm to them than good, and it just cannot happen. We have to be able to reward these teams for making it to the conference titles, especially with a lot of the issues in the conferences right now, and we'll talk about that here in a second. We have to give these teams host positions. We just have to. Whether or not it's a Big Ten team, say, craziness happens and Penn State makes it to the championship and gets blown out by Oregon. That would be an 11-2 team that would not necessarily have all the wins that we would like to see them have. They would still have to get in. They would still have to host a playoff game because if they didn't, Tony Petitti's coming banging down your door and they're getting together with Greg Sankey and stuff's happening in a hurry. I'm just being totally honest. So it's one of those situations that we could talk about the resume and we could talk about which team is better and we could talk about, Tennessee did beat Alabama when they played them. So it would be a 10-3 Alabama against a 10-2 Tennessee, and I totally get the argument there. The thing is, you just can't do it. You can't do it because it would totally change the fabric of the sport pretty much overnight. You would have the Big Ten and the SEC coming together in a hurry, and you would have a problem on your hands pretty much by Monday after the Selection Sunday. So you have to be careful. That's all I'm going to say. With a terrible conference format that we'll get to here right in a second, it's going to be one of those things where if you earn your right into a title playoff game, or into a title game, you have to make the playoff. Period. End of story. Frankly, I don't think you should move down at all in the rankings because if you do that, you have a problem on your hands that could totally change what college football is. So I understand what Lane Kiffin's saying, and I understand why that is a worry. If that is something that comes to fruition, welcome to the new reality of college football, which is AFC and NFC. But we'll see what happens there. Definitely going to be something to watch, and hopefully they don't punish anyone, because if they do, we got a problem on our hands in a hurry. Let's talk about that conference setup, because there are some issues with it. No doubt about that. It is a terrible conference setup that we have right now, and this is much less about the 12-team playoff, more about conference realignment, but it is affecting the 12-team playoff in a big-time way. You know, you have a Tennessee team, let's say, that has played a relatively tough schedule, has been, to different atmospheres, has played tough teams, has won a big-time game against Alabama, obviously lost the gross one against Arkansas, so that is something you can absolutely throw back at them. But I do think it is one of those scenarios where in a normal year in the SEC, without Texas and Oklahoma, without a couple of these new teams, and without no divisions, Tennessee's probably pretty firmly in the mix. They're probably pretty firmly in the 12-team playoff if this is not a situation where they have new teams coming in and the conferences or the schedules are totally different from one another. And we'll talk about Texas here for a second. I think they're a great team, no doubt about that. I really do think this is one of the most talented and one of the highest ability teams in the world. There you go Buffs, yes sir. It's going to be incredible to watch this unfold, but I think you look at Texas, they're a very good team, no doubt about that. If they lose to A&M, they should not be in or around playoff contention, and I very much do mean that. I think if you're going to get into the playoff, you have to prove that you can play on the field with one of the elite teams in the country. They didn't prove it against Georgia. If they don't prove it against A&M, they should not get in. I don't care if they're 10-2 and they have a couple of really good losses. That is one of the more annoying things that I've been hearing around the CFP right about now is good losses. They're losses. Let's just move forward. Let's figure out how we're gonna discern this. And overall, I think for Texas, they're a very good team. If they go 10-2 and they get in over Tennessee, we got a problem on our hands. I'll just be totally honest. And then on the other side, you do have Penn State. Let's say Penn State were to lose another game. No world where they should be in. They haven't won that big-time game. They played Ohio State tough. Ohio State gave them plenty of chances to play them tough, no doubt about that. So it's going to be really interesting to watch all of this unfold, and definitely in pretty much every conference, it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold, but particularly in the SEC. That's the one where you see that big-time logjam. That's the one where you see all those big-time issues, and this is something that just needs to be fixed. And I do tend to believe that it will be fixed, at least from a perspective of schedule imbalance. I do think they'll figure this out. I don't know if they go back to divisions. I don't know if they go to a pod system that the SEC was talking about. But at the end of the day, they got to get this fixed. It can't be Texas has only played Georgia and A&M by the end of the year, but Georgia's played Texas, Ole Miss, Alabama, Clemson, and Tennessee. That can't be the format that we go forward with. That can't be the way that this works out, because in a normal format where everything was totally even, I think we'd have a very different rankings of these SEC teams right about now. So that's the one where you really see the issues, but definitely something to watch as we get a little bit deeper into this thing. And then out-of-conference schedules, because there are some implications here, especially in this season in particular, and I want to make this very, very clear. I am not trying to tear down Indiana. They have been the example that a lot of people have used, but I'm not trying to tear them down. I think they are a very good team. I think they are relatively worthy of where they should be right about now. But Indiana did play a very, very bad out-of-conference schedule. They played FIU, Western Illinois, and Charlotte. And the biggest issue with this is Western Illinois was not on the schedule before, I believe, February or January, when they got out of a Louisville game to play Western Illinois. And not necessarily to play Western Illinois, but they got out of a Louisville game and scheduled Western Illinois. So that's an issue. There's no doubt about that. Because if they had played Louisville and they had won that game, I'd be sitting here saying, even if they lose on Saturday by 30 points, they should be in the field. But they didn't play Louisville. They played Western Illinois, so they're in the situation where they have to go prove it on Saturday. So this is one of those issues where I don't want to say you're rewarding Indiana for playing nobody, but you kind of are to a certain degree. You kind of are putting in, the biggest issue would be if they put them in the field, if they lose by 25 to Ohio State on Saturday and still put them in the field, then you'd really be rewarding them for an out-of-conference schedule that is not very talented and not very good. So definitely something to watch there. And then Ole Miss doesn't get off with this by any means. The best out-of-conference game they played was Wake Forest. So not necessarily all that tough, and really layup games the rest of the way. They got ready for the conference schedule, 4-0, dominating teams. People thought they were one of the best teams in the country, and since conference play has started, they had 2 losses, but they had 2 losses to play around with. That is kind of the approach that a lot of these teams are taking, and I can't necessarily blame them for taking it. If you're going to reward some teams for not necessarily playing really tough out of conferences, I'm not going to play a tough out of conference. Why would I play a tough out of conference if we're going to, reward teams for not? And I'm not going to sit here and say we should reward Penn State or Texas or Tennessee for scheduling a West Virginia or a Michigan or an NC State that didn't necessarily end up being all that great. But we do need to encourage teams to schedule those games. We do need to encourage teams to play a Georgia versus Clemson, which I think should probably bump Georgia up a little bit in the rankings right about now. Or Texas-Ohio State is playing next year. We have to encourage teams to continue to schedule those games. So I think teams will do this. If you give them the opportunity to say, we're just going to play 3 tomato cans and move on with our schedule, they're going to take it and run with it. That's kind of the reality of this situation. They need as many losses to play around with once they get into the conference schedule. If you're going to give them the ability to play tomato can 1, 2, 3, and 4, they're going to play tomato can 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's going to be really interesting to watch. I do think this will happen if they give them the opportunity. I don't really know what that would look like. Maybe if Indiana gets in, maybe you do see a couple of these games canceled, like that Louisville-Indiana game earlier in the year, or a couple of different things. Just one of those situations where if I have wiggle room now, I want to get as deep into the season with that wiggle room still intact. So it's going to be interesting to watch. Definitely one of those things that could have implications down the road. But Texas just scheduled a series with Notre Dame in 28 and 29. I wouldn't be surprised if the next couple of years it continues to go like this. I wouldn't be surprised if those games were never played, because there's not really a motivation from either of those teams to play those games if you're going to let them in regardless. So definitely something to watch, and definitely one of those things that, depending on what they do with Indiana, a lot of things could change about the schedules for the out-of-conference teams going forward. And then the worst one of the bunch, resting starters possibly, and man, that Joey Galloway take might have been one of the worst takes that I've ever heard in my life. I'll be totally honest with you. It was insane. And if you haven't heard it, he suggested that Indiana bench Curtis Rourke on Saturday. They rest him to avoid a Jordan Travis situation, as he dubbed it. Jordan Travis got injured against North Alabama, so wouldn't exactly be a Jordan Travis situation, but obviously Curtis Rourke is going to play. There's no doubt about that. He is a competitor. Curt Cignetti is not going to let him not play. He is going to push him out there on the field and let him go to work. So this is not an issue for this game. I'm not arguing that. They are going to play their best players, plain and simple. They are not going to take anything for granted, because there still is the chance that they do fall out with a blowout loss. So definitely something that I'm not worried about that game in particular. I am worried about the idea in general, because SMU plays Virginia this weekend. If they beat Virginia this weekend, they're in the ACC title. Congratulations, you have set yourself up in your very first year. And something we should talk about is how many teams in their first year are getting to their conference championships, but definitely something we will break down a little bit later. But all of these different things, if you get a win this weekend, you are in the ACC title. Then you have Cal at home next week. There's a very real world where they sit Kevin Jennings, let him get healthy for that back-end stretch and for that ACC championship, and I wouldn't necessarily be able to blame him too aggressively. I don't think necessarily it's the right thing to do. I would love all the players to play all the games, but you look up at the NFL, if they got nothing to lose, if they have no seeding or anything to lose, they will rest their starters in the final game. So maybe that's the way that we're heading, and SMU might be the very first to kind of kick over that can. Oregon does play Washington next week. They're already in the Big Ten Championship. Now, this one's a little bit different, because Oregon wants to win that game very badly. Dan Lanning is not going to take an off day on that day, because he badly wants to beat the team that knocked him out of the CFP last year. All that being said, they could do that. Say they were playing Purdue, or say they were playing Northwestern. I think they would, and I would not blame them for doing that. So all of that being said, I do think these kids want to compete. I do think a lot of these kids will not miss games because they just want to play football. I also do think there will be business decisions that have to be made, one way or the other, because you look up the NFL, it's the perfect example. It is a conference, it is a league that is very, very tough to deal with, and it's one of those things where sometimes you just got to rest your body towards the end of the year. I don't necessarily think it's going to happen too much this year, but if people look around this time next year and say, we're pretty much in the 12-team playoff, we might as well rest a couple of these guys and continue on our way fully healthy, it's one of those things that's almost just bound to happen at some point. We'll just see how quickly that it happens. But Overall, I've really enjoyed this year. The 12-team playoff has given us some great things. It's given us some not so great things. But you do see some of the examples that people were saying when they said it would ruin the regular season. I didn't necessarily fully agree with that, but I understand where a lot of those people were coming from, because now you're looking at maybe 5 years down the road. Teams aren't scheduling tough out-of-conference games. They're resting starters in the final week or maybe final weeks of the season, depending on the scenario. And the first couple and the last couple of weeks of the season are relatively bland. Obviously, you'll have the rivalry. Obviously, you'll have big games. No doubt about that. You'll have teams fighting for their lives. You won't have quite as much as you expected in this 12-team playoff. So all of this can be fixed in a number of different ways with a number of different, playoff formats and different things, incentives and all of that type of thing. But we do got to get in control, because it's one of those situations where as you expand the 12-team playoff, you do also expand or take away some of the variability to get left out of that playoff. So some of these teams that are firmly in, like SMU or like Oregon, they might just kind of bow out and say, we're just going to hang out this last week of the season, make sure all of our guys get healthy, and then we'll attack the back half. So it's something to watch, definitely. The consequences of this thing were always going to come to fruition at some point. They're starting to show themselves a little bit. Hopefully we'll get them fixed, but definitely something to watch as we head into 2025, and we'll see if any of those out-of-conference games get canceled this upcoming offseason. But we'll break it all down with time, no doubt about that. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we got a Week 13 whip around. A ton of games that I want to talk about real quick, and we'll break them down right after this.